There seems to be this propaganda campaign to convince people that Trump is going to lose. And Democrats are doing everything except what you're supposed to do in a campaign, namely mobilize your voters. And you mobilize people, the primary way is to give them what they want, give them something that they need and want. Biden is adamant there'll be no Medicare for all, something that almost every Democrat wants, and a lot of Republicans want too. So all of the things that people need right now, especially in this year of the COVID pandemic and so much dislocation, the job losses, the inadequate stimulus bills, the fact that the additional $600 that unemployed people were getting is about to run out, the fact that there are states that people still can't seem to access their benefits. He's not offered anything that addresses any of those issues. People are desperate. And that's the first way you reach people. You address some need they have. But he's committed to not doing that. And that's why they chose him. That's why they rigged the primaries in his favor. It's why Obama chose him, to get that more conservative Democrat, although he was plenty conservative himself, in 2016. And I will never forget 2016. And I've often thought about what I missed, because I also thought Hillary Clinton was going to win. I did not know that she had made a mess of the voter outreach. Basically, she didn't bother with it. The degree of voter suppression, for example, Wisconsin, one of those states that flipped, we're told. Wisconsin enacted a voter ID law. Thousands of people couldn't vote. He won this, he's 20,000 votes, I think. People either could not vote or thought they could not vote and didn't bother. They made it very difficult for college students to register. So all these voters that Democratic presidential candidates got in Wisconsin were just taken off the rolls. The cross-check, the vote purging schemes. My home state of a place where I was born, Ohio, you have to vote in a federal election, and that means Congress. That means every 2 years. If you didn't vote in 2018, you cannot vote in 2020 unless you re-register. So those are the kinds of things that Republicans do that Democrats never say anything about. And I read today in Politico that Republicans are at least claiming that they've had people knocking on doors 1 million times. And the Democrats plan to just do TV commercials and emails and so forth. All the things Hillary Clinton did. What we should learn from Al Gore's loss, the theft of the 2000 election, the theft in 2016. When they say someone's ahead in the polls, assuming the polls are accurate at all in the first place, what is the polling in Pennsylvania? What's the polling in Michigan? What is it in Wisconsin? What is the voter outreach like? What is the voter suppression like? Those numbers are meaningless. They are absolutely meaningless. And then you have the problem of Biden himself. He was never very bright. He was always dumb. He was always rather odd. But now he clearly has some sort of health problem, a cognitive problem. He doesn't know where he is. He blurts out. A couple of days ago, a black reporter was talking to him and asked him about this cognitive test. And he got mad and said, suppose you were tested for cocaine, something crazy.
Were you a junkie? He screamed.
Yes,
I think,
yes. Are you a junkie? Then it was Latino voters are very diverse, and unlike black people. So then they get this right-wing Latina to be the Latino voter outreach person. So all of these things add up to him losing. And all the things they keep saying about Trump, Trump will quit. Trump can't win. And it's a substitute for policy.
Yep.
You get people out when you offer them something. Obama got a big turnout. There was this promise of, hope and change or something. So there was something affirmative. It's not enough to say people don't like Trump. There are people who don't like Trump who still are not motivated voters. These stories about him quitting, it's a lie, and it's meant to try to drag Biden over the finish line, and I don't think it's going to work.
No, there's a good chance that it won't work. And exactly as you said, this need to deflect from real policy discussion, from the needs of just workers in general. But we also have to look at how Biden's comment about black voters is indicative of a trend in the Democratic Party since
Sure.
the so-called end of the civil rights movement, where black people are taken for granted, that they're always going to vote Democrat because the Republican Party is the white man's party. It's the party of racism. And now we're seeing a generational divide in that sort of phenomenon. But by making these comments publicly, you run the risk of alienating even just a few,
Well,
and that could make a huge difference as well.
sure, sure,
It's just how
sure.
it works, especially with the Electoral College, and then the liberals, the white liberals especially, but we know the Black misleadership class also dabbles in this. The idea that Trump won't leave and Trump is going to
I know.
stay in office, and even if he loses, right, there's almost this assumption that Biden is going to win, and that Donald Trump is going to stay and he's going to mobilize his far right forces to keep him in office, right? There's all this specter of World War II Germany or something of the
I
sort
know.
that the Democrats have been peddling since
Sure. Well, they do that. They
2015.
do. They do it to shut us up. It's like you're not supposed to ask
Exactly.
anything because he's Hitler or Mussolini at the very least.
Exactly.
And it's very funny. Well, not haha funny. I guess ironically funny that we have this really sad situation. I know people who say, I'm not voting for Biden. Now, most of them say they live in a safe state, of solidly blue state or a solidly red state. He doesn't need my vote. I don't have to vote for him. But what that means is in those states where he desperately needs those votes, he doesn't have the enthusiasm.
Hmm.
And that counts for something too. So you have the Republicans perfecting their voter suppression, their vote theft operation, and Democrats acting like everything is fine. And if they can just hide him enough till November.
Yes.
So the latest propaganda is he doesn't need to debate. He shouldn't debate Trump because Trump's such a liar and it'll give Trump credibility. When have you heard anybody say that someone shouldn't debate? There have been debates ever since 1980, and they're trying to hide him. And as we've just been talking about the crazy things he said, they have a good reason to want to hide him.
Yes.
They coalesced around him because they wanted to make clear that nothing progressive is going to happen. As he famously said to a group of rich funders, nothing's going to fundamentally change. So they're telling us everything that we want is off the table, is not being discussed. Forget about it. You're not even getting a little bit of it. So they foist this guy on most Democrats. I'm not a Democrat anymore. I'm green. But they foist him on Democrats and they're expected to go along. They get rid of Bernie Sanders like a good little chump. He goes along. We have to get rid of Trump. Trump's the most dangerous president, except they give him, all the defense spending he wants and go along with the bipartisan consensus. But he's the most dangerous ever. And that means people aren't going to vote for Trump, but it does not mean they're going to come out for Biden. It just doesn't. And I don't know how much of this is for show. Part of me says they don't care if Trump wins. They're really not that concerned. They can live with Trump. But it's a lot of smoke and mirrors. They're already talking about foreign election interference. Kanye West, a crazy entertainer, is apparently letting people get him on the ballot in a few states, and other people are like, oh, it's going to take votes for Joe
As
Biden. I
part of the
don't think it
birthday
is.
party. No
Yeah,
lie. The birthday party. That's what he's running on.
it's anybody who votes for Kanye West wasn't going to vote at all. So there's all this drama, all this performance, and the people get the shaft. We're not getting any of the things we need. This is a watershed year. This pandemic has exposed the extent of the failure of the system, and we've got this okey doke election with the okey doke guy. Not even
Mm.
okey doke. That's a it's an overstatement.
And to highlight your point about the so-called election interference accusations, just today there was a breaking story that, of course, the unnamed intelligence operatives that have given us Russiagate, that are currently spreading innuendo about China hacking into all U.S. tech companies and taking our data. We now have a report that says that the U.S. intelligence services are looking at Russia, China, and Iran. How convenient. Three countries that the United States finds abhorrent and wants to overthrow because they're the biggest competitors on the world stage economically, especially. And now those countries are gearing up to shape the election, right? And what has always been hilarious about the election interference accusations is that, of course, there was never any hard evidence that
No.
something was done in 2016. And it was completely made up on that line, that there was a direct intervention. But then there's this line, and it's very ideological. It's all about blaming other countries for the failures of this one, that China or Russia, they have an opinion about the election. So that's shaping it. Now they're manipulating Black Lives Matter, for example, or they're manipulating activists in the streets, or they're manipulating voters into choosing a particular candidate. And it's absolutely preposterous, but it just goes to show how far the intelligence services will go on behest of the corporate donors who want to see a favorable outcome in the election and don't want any sort of discussion about real policy, how far they'll go to make sure that this election goes as it's supposed to, business as usual, and that all the demands that real people, ordinary people want are suppressed and basically completely out of the discussion.
You know, it's a funny thing. You know when a story is BS when it's always an anonymous source. So a couple of weeks ago, it was China and Russia hacking into vaccine makers' computers to steal vaccine information. And they were always anonymous sources. They didn't even say who was hacked. I mean, if it was a genuine story, you might have an anonymous source, but it would say the Acme pharmaceutical company was hacked and Russians are suspected or something. No, it's nothing. There's never anything there. Earlier this year, it was Russians prefer Bernie Sanders. And then a couple of days later, it's, oh, did we say that? It's kind of a overstatement. And they're doing it again. And it's propaganda. That's all it is. And Americans don't like to think they're being propagandized, but we're being propagandized to be quiet, to go along with Joe Biden, to not question anything. And this is how they are going about doing it. And they're already planning for Biden's loss, it seems to me, so that when he loses, no one blames them, the people who cooked up this scheme and foisted him on their voters.
Yeah, and there's a real interest, especially this election period, to target Black people in particular because of the uprising that happened and that is currently still ongoing, and how that sort of shook up the conversation about race again. And there was a real need to jump on that by the ruling class and to control it and to shape it and to make it into something that's palatable, that
Right.
is electorally friendly. And there is a concern, I think there's a real genuine concern among the Democratic Party establishment that there is going to be more and more momentum, at least in terms of just how generally people are feeling, especially Black people, that there's going to be demands on the table, and that something like what happened after George Floyd was killed and what continues to happen in cities across the country, that could lead to some form of accountability being placed on the Democratic Party and being placed on the Congressional Black Caucus, for example. And that is just something that the Democratic Party establishment wants to avoid entirely, which is
Sure.
partly the reason why I think that Donald Trump is never challenged. It's not just that the Democratic Party is pro-war. It's not just that they agree with him on saber rattling with China or escalating tensions with Russia or sanctions on Iran. It's not just that they agree. Of course, that's a major part, but also that when Donald Trump does these things at their behest, and it also benefits them because now Donald Trump is sort of just doing what the ruling class wants, and there's no accountability. The Democrats don't have to do anything, right? And that's also part of the reason why Trump is always the one who has the spotlight on him in the corporate media. It's because the Democrats don't have to do anything if
Right.
Donald Trump is constantly either the problem or he's being constantly measured as how much in proximity is he to what the ruling class really wants when he wages war. It's always one or the other, right?
He's the perfect foil. He's their poster
Yeah,
child. They
exactly.
use him to scare people. They use him to keep people in line, to keep us from asking questions. They use him to raise money. So he's a gift to them, really. All they do is say Donald Trump, and that's supposed to answer a plethora of questions. This year, it's complicated by the fact that so many people have narrowed their demand down to having a black vice presidential candidate. Having had a black president, having a black vice presidential candidate is not exciting people. A lot of black people basically don't like Kamala Harris. All that bragging about putting people in jail, they know they need a junior president. He may not serve out his term at all. They need somebody who they will be comfortable with being president. They want to make the movement devoid of any substance, and they succeeded, unfortunately. A lot of people are co-opted. A lot of people just aren't experienced politically, aren't very sophisticated. So anybody saying Black Lives Matter, corporations that also give money to the police, anything and everything is used in entertainment. It's like we won't have Gone with the Wind on TV anymore. I don't care. Let people watch Gone with the Wind. It doesn't change any of the issues that we're trying to struggle against. And there are a lot of issues to struggle against. Police violence was the one that brought people out, but I think a lot of people stayed out because of the other issues we talked about, the unemployment, the insecurity, the fact that we have two political parties committed to not meeting anybody's needs. We shall see how it all turns out. I was debating, it's like, if he loses, should I laugh? Will that be like a... I will. By the way, I'm not debating anymore.
Well, it was like Hillary Clinton lost in 2016, and we thought, wow, she was that bad that she lost to Donald Trump. If Joe Biden loses in 2020 with all of the myriad of disasters and crises that the United States is facing, and Joe Biden still loses, then what else can you do but laugh? Especially if you're of the political persuasion that these two parties don't serve us anyway. So speaking of monumental problems right now, and this has been a monumental problem since the U.S.'s inception, but especially since 1945, the U.S.'s drive toward endless war. There's been a lot of moves. You've been on China's global television network recently talking a lot about the new Cold War against China. We just had an event that we all participated in, whether organizing or speaking, for the No Cold War Coalition. And we have a situation now where China is public enemy number one. And of course, talking about China gets a lot of negative attention here in the United States since public opinion is so low right now on China's role in the world. But we see that the United States is acting as an aggressor once again towards a country that is competitive economically, that has a different system. And some of these moves that have just happened in recent days, Donald Trump announced a ban not only on TikTok, one of the most, if not the most popular social media application in the world, but he's also added WeChat into there. And for those who don't know WeChat is a very popular social media app in China that really does facilitate a lot of cross-country communication. And just as Donald Trump announced visa restrictions, that if international students weren't going to school here in person, that they had to go back to their country of origin, and this hurt a lot of Chinese students here in the United States, WeChat is a very important tool for Chinese Americans, but just anyone who has a relationship with China. And it could have far-reaching implications for the U.S. economically, just like how the trade war was really a disaster for U.S. corporations. A WeChat ban could really be a disaster for phone and tech corporations for the United States, because China is the biggest market for technology right now. And if U.S. corporations like Apple can't put WeChat on their phones, you're likely not going to be able to access that market. So that's a huge deal. We also have sanctions again on Hong Kong, another round of sanctions on officials. The U.S. has put on multiple iterations of this in recent months, but this time it's against Chief Executive Carrie Lam of Hong Kong, as well as 11 officials in the legislature there. But this comes amid a lot of escalations militarily in the South China Sea in July, sending aircraft carriers, naval fleets, not to mention the 400 military bases that basically occupy the Asia Pacific against China. And then we've also seen just the constant innuendo about Xinjiang, for example, where once again, anonymous sources peddled by people like Adrian Zenz, a far-right fundamentalist, are really report it as fact, and then have policy implications like the sanctioning of the Communist Party of China based on this policy, which is 98 million people, and again, creates a very hostile dynamic between the two countries. So yeah, let's talk about just how this issue of China is not just about China, it's about the US's drive towards endless war, which is really a massive problem that the left, for the most part, has been silent on.
Well, they do two things. This war propaganda against China, they've discovered the way to silence people on the left is to claim that there are human rights abuses. So it starts with Saddam Hussein. Assad is gassing his own people. Venezuela, he's a tyrant. It goes on and on and on. They get buy-in. Gaddafi's troops were given Viagra so they could rape a lot, something Susan Rice repeated very often, by the way. So now with China, it's the Uighurs, the people from Xinjiang. We're told that there are 1 million people in concentration camps. There's no evidence for this. Absolutely none. There's no corroboration. But it's been repeated, and that's the evil genius of propaganda. Just keep saying it. Just keep saying it. And people believe it. It's like a song that was a hit when you were a kid, and years later you hear it again and you realize you know the lyrics. And you're like, I can't believe I can still remember that song. Well, that's what this is. And there's no pushback. There's no counter narrative allowed. Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, basically declared war on China in an extraordinary speech a couple of weeks ago. He called Xi Jinping a liar, called his foreign minister a liar, said communists always lie. That means there's going to be no diplomacy. How do you speak of people like that and expect to have a serious conversation with them? Well, you can't. That means they don't care anymore. So that was the opening salvo. Then it was TikTok is being forced to sell its U.S. business, not just U.S. business, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand, the Five Eyes countries, the surveillance state countries that were spawned by British colonialism. And we're told, and Democrats repeat this too, they don't say China anymore without saying Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party will have access to your data. Well, guess what? The U.S. surveillance state has access to your data. The NSA scoops up everything, every email, every social media post. U.S. intelligence has it. Facebook and Twitter, they are required to turn over any information requests that come from the government. This idea that the Chinese Communist Party is interested in my data is just stupid, but it's effective too. I mean, who has our data? Hackers, scammers, spammers. And now we're supposed to be worried that China could have your information because you use TikTok. This is a scam, but I'm afraid it's going to succeed. And after that crazy speech, the New York Times, what did they say? They just sort of, yeah, well, we would have said it this way or that way. Once again, we see the bipartisan consensus, the corporate media consensus. How is China going to react? They have banned Huawei, the Huawei phones, because they can't be spied on. And they bully so-called allies, and we should just call them vassal states. They're puppet governments. Canada and the UK and NATO, they do just what the United States tells them to do. So if they're told they've got to get rid of TikTok, if they're told they can't use Huawei phones, then they don't do it either. China is a competitor, and China and its allies are working to thwart the U.S., which is a good thing. So when the U.S. Sanctions Iran and makes it almost impossible for Iran to conduct any financial transactions in the world, China throws them a lifeline and says, we'll buy your oil too. Iran helps Venezuela. Venezuela just opened it's a chain of supermarkets that are Iranian because they're trying to starve Venezuelans. So every time these countries try to have a counter move to oppose U.S. aggression, then the U.S. attacks in another way. But it isn't going to work. How did China get to be an economic superpower? The U.S. turned over its manufacturing capacity to China. And lo and behold, who would have thunk? Now China will soon have the largest economy in the world, and it is a competitor to the U.S. But this is very, very frightening to me. I don't know what to call it. It's not just a war of words. As far as I'm concerned, without soldiers on the battlefield, it's still a declaration of war, and it's extremely dangerous.
Oh, yes. It is so extremely dangerous, especially when you have a situation where there are a large number of people in the United States, especially on the left, unfortunately, that go along with this and that believe in the false equivalencies between the
Because
United States
concentration
and
camps,
China.
Uyghur
Exactly.
concentration camp, the Uyghurs are now,
Exactly.
they're like the poster children for
Right.
everything. And
Exactly.
so people who don't like Trump will think this is true. And the
Right.
propaganda machine keeps going on and on and
Yep.
on. And the usual, no counter narrative is allowed to see the light of day. If you care
Hmm.
about human rights, who doesn't want to care about human rights? Well, then you have to hate
Exactly.
China because China's so evil. There's one liberal pundit who says they're akin to the Nazis. I mean, it's horrible. It's
No,
absolutely
it's
horrible.
so horrible. I actually just recently wrote an article because ESPN got in on the mix on their so-called investigation of the NBA's relations with China. And the article itself was 3,000 plus words. It was unfocused. It basically repeated all of the State Department's talking points
Right.
and then didn't really give any evidence, of course, beyond anonymous sources because, of course, the employees who reported on this were too afraid for their livelihoods. Well, let's see. How does WikiLeaks get their sources to give information? Well, they don't just rely on people's observations. You need to have evidence. You need to have documented evidence. You need to have leaks of some kind. And don't get me started with the China cables, which literally is a concoction of exiled so-called Uighurs who are basically working with Adrian Zenz to promote the same
Mm-hmm.
concentration camp lies, say that they have Chinese government documents, won't verify that they're the documents, and completely exaggerate what's in the documents. If you read the China cables, you don't get any sense that there's some sort of mass torture regime here. You get the sense that what's going on is that there is a measure against terrorists who did blow up things in the country and happened to kill thousands of people in thousands of different attacks over the course of 16
And
years.
join jihadists in Syria.
Exactly. And join jihadists in Syria, and that Xinjiang has a real border issue with countries that, lo and behold, the United States has ravaged and created that problem in many senses of the word. So, in this article, I talk about how if you're going to be a journalist, and this guy, Steve Faineru, he went to Iraq at one point in his career, reported, embedded himself in military contractors in Iraq, and talked about the atrocities. That's journalism. But just repeating State Department talking points, talking about observations that you've seen, and then not even be able to get any testimony out of the so-called MBA academies where, and there were some really racist accusations of corporal punishments and, that there were observations from employees that there were balls being thrown at players and all this crap to basically just make the people of China look like, criminals and dehumanize them. But to not even get any evidence, verifications, documents, anything at all, sort of like what WikiLeaks does when it wants to leak something, is to me criminal in and of itself and just shows that we cannot believe anything that comes out
Nope.
of the mouths of the corporate media out of Washington, D.C. And it's so important that we oppose this, what I believe is an outright war, but I guess appropriate to call it a Cold War, another
Yeah,
iteration of a
yeah.
Cold War against China, because this is the strategy of U.S. imperialism right now. U.S. imperialism is in crisis. It has labeled Russia and China as the two biggest enemies and threats, and that all of the measures that we see around the world right now that the U.S. is taking has always been geared towards containing those two countries and their influence, and it's caused such utter devastation. Luckily for China, they have an economic base where they can sustain these hits. And while it may economically hurt just a bit, they can still go forward with their anti-poverty program. They can still go forward with their progress in high tech and environment and all of that because they've been able to build the infrastructure for that. But when we talk about a country like Syria, for example, which has been ravaged by the United States,
Yeah.
the sanctions are just devastating. I mean,
Yeah.
causing the Syrian lira to go up in terms of inflation, starving people literally. Same thing in Venezuela, same thing in Zimbabwe. We can go down the list of dozens of countries where this is true. And then the US is still bombing countries, building military bases, and yet China is supposed to be the problem here. And I
Yeah.
just think that it's so infuriating that so many, especially on the left, are so willing to go along with whatever the National Endowment for Democracy says on China, yet if it were about any other issue, the corporate media, let's say on the elections, a lot of these leftists would say, "Oh, that's all lies. You know, it's a
Well,
lie that Joe Biden is the candidate for us because we have his record." Well, why isn't the same true about China? And I think it really does come down to racism. It comes down to the fact that China has been demonized, dehumanized, and this country has such a long history with this. And of course, at Black Agenda Report, we know so much about this that how the black movement, how black people have been treated in this country has been exported around the world as the
oh, sure. Well,
ideology of how
people,
the war machine works.
it's funny, but they leave out the fact that the Uyghurs were exempt from the one-child policy. When China had this one-child policy per family for decades, they were exempt. The number of
Hmm.
mosques has increased in that
It
region,
has, and it's
and
everywhere. When I was there, it's everywhere. Yeah, they're everywhere.
but nobody tells you those things. And once again, unless you have the inclination or wherewithal to actively seek out independent sources, unless you know that you should, then you'll go along with China is evil, communists always lie, Chinese Communist Party wants your data, there's a concentration camp. I mean, it's classic. It is how you get people in a mood for war, a Cold War at the very least, and maybe even a hot war. And once again, we see the bipartisan nature. The other day, I heard Chuck Schumer talking about the Chinese Communist Party wanting your data with TikTok. And so he was right down the line with Trump and supporting Trump's policy. This is not going to end well. We've been hearing for years now about de-dollarization. The dollar is the world reserve currency. If I was going to guess, and I'm going to admit that I am guessing, that's going to be the outcome of all this sanctioning, of all these efforts to suppress other countries, to prevent them from being US rivals. Dollar hegemony is going to end. And that means the American people are going to suffer. You and I and everybody else, we are going to suffer when that happens.
Yeah, and we are
And
already suffering. Yeah, no, it's
yes,
true.
we are. But nobody even knows that. You know, if you read the New York Times and listen to NPR and watch MSNBC, you wouldn't know anything that we're talking about. So it is rather frightening. But we, let's just be affirmative here, we have to keep doing what we're doing. And that's why I take every opportunity to talk about these issues. And I hope our viewers watch the entire webinar, No Cold War on China. You can see it on YouTube. It's very nice now on
Yes.
YouTube. It's
Oh yeah,
broken
yeah,
up.
yeah.
Everybody, every speaker has their own segment. You don't have to sit through the whole thing. So take it in chunks. Everybody speaks for 7 or 8 minutes. And I urge everybody to watch that because it's an amazing educational tool that we have to avail ourselves of.
Of course, and I'll definitely try to link that in the description. Let's close with just all the things we've been talking about. I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking just as the US and Glenn Ford talks about this all the time, basically delegitimized its electoral system through Russiagate and, all of the various ways of electoral interference. It delegitimizes its election system through those means that Russia, China, Iran, all these countries are trying to destroy the election system. Well, your election system doesn't seem that strong then. What a contradiction when we talk about
Yes.
American exceptionalism. Just as they do that, the same thing is happening abroad now with TikTok and the high-tech war that the US is basically conceding. When it makes these moves, it's basically saying, we're not going to compete anymore. We're
Right.
going to just ban, we're going to punish. And what that's going to do, it's going to blow back on the US capitalist economy, which very much relies upon all of these supply chains all over the world to build these products and to have the ability to access the market in China for all of its various components. So that's going to have a huge impact. But I think what all of this shows is that war is so central to the economic and political future of the United States at this moment of crisis that that's the priority. And, to be honest, whether if a Democrat was in right now and it would be different, I don't think is really the point. I think what we see is that there is a bipartisan consensus and that everything that has led up to this point with the US and China has been the responsibility also of the Democratic Party, building this military industrial complex and pivot to Asia and putting in the dominoes and laying the framework and foundations for what we see now, this great power competition and this all-out full frontal assault on China to try to arrest China's economic development, which is a pipe dream because, as you said, China is going to look elsewhere. It just signed a huge deal with Iran, $400 billion plus dollars. We know even more than that is invested in Russia. We know that China is willing to work with anybody, regardless of their political and economic system, which means that China is treating the world openly and seeking to work with everybody, while the United States sees that as a huge threat. Just the idea of economic
Well,
cooperation at this point is a threat because the U.S. just does not have anything to offer economically to
no, it
anybody.
doesn't. You know, it's funny. You just reminded me. One of the other cudgel they used to beat China with is COVID-19. It's all their fault. They started there.
Oh,
They
yes,
hid
that's one of the
things.
most pathetic ones.
And
Yep.
but I look at it differently. In about a month, China conquered that disease. For middle of December, they knew people were getting sick. They weren't sure what was going on. A month later, they sequenced the genome. They told the world, here it is. Do your testing. Let's make a vaccine. China's the one saying we're going to create a vaccine for the whole world. And the U.S. response is to claim that they're stealing secrets from the United States. It's the U.S. that is the failed state here. It's funny, all of the assertions made about China are actually true about this country. It's just the opposite. But people
Exactly.
here are suffering, and if the suffering continues, all the propaganda in the world won't stop people if they have no home, if they have no unemployment, if they have no job, their unemployment runs out, if they literally are going hungry, then we will see which is the failed state and which one is the violator of human rights. We are going to see that then.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, we're going to close up here, and I'm going to leave our viewers with one question. If what the US says about China, let's say in regards to Xinjiang, is true, why is it that Reuters, for example, toured Xinjiang? They went to Urumqi upon permission from the central government in China, and then they refused to report on it. And then they had anonymous officials basically saying that the trip was choreographed by the central government of China. But, other countries went too, 24 different countries, journalists went. And one thing that you find out about that visit, and one thing I found out when I was there, is that these so-called concentration camps are really, and some of them are boarding schools, and some of them are prisons for people who did commit some of these crimes. I mean, we're talking about taking arms from another source. Usually, these arms came from outside of the country. Then using them, training sometimes children to do things like blow up buses, mosques. Ironically, that happened. And so, of course, some of them are prisons, but a lot of it is geared toward helping reintegrate people who went through those experiences so they can get an education, which, if you're a Uyghur in China or one of the other 50 different ethnic groups, you have preference in education and in jobs. No one talks about that either. So the question is, why is it that it's so hard to find hard evidence, concrete evidence, when journalists did go there?
Well, let's talk about the United States, which has 2 million people in prison, often for minor offenses. There was a story this week of a black man in Louisiana, who received a life sentence for committing a minor offense. He stole hedge clippers or something. Actually tried that. I don't think even succeeded. And the court ruled that it was a reasonable sentence. There are several thousand people serving life sentences here for crimes other than murder. And so we have a concentration camp system, and it's called the mass incarceration system. Someone needs to give us some regime change, and so we get a less abusive system. Let's see how that works.
Exactly. Now, I posted on Twitter, if you're not talking about solitary confinement in the United States as torture, then you have no right to talk about torture anywhere by any other country, especially torture that you cannot prove. So, all right, we'll leave it there. Please like, subscribe, share the video. We will be back with you again very soon, and thanks for tuning into Left Lens.